when we go to the 1953 tournament, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, the book by Bronstein, right? One of the best chess books ever, or at least one of the best tournament books ever written.
Yes.
Right? What do you think?
I would say one of the best books, and I think it's one that what their favourite book is. It's amazing how many of them mention that one.
Yeah.
One of the things, though, again, the tournament was, I think, the longest of all of the candidates events. I think it was 28 rounds, and I think other ones were 28 rounds, but in terms of the duration of that event, it lasted, I think, over 2 months. But yeah, it's probably one of the most famous books ever written, and there does seem to be this ambiguity over who wrote it. But yeah, a wonderful book, and it was a fantastic tournament. You know, when you look at the lineup of players who were in it, what a wonderful event. So many great names. I think as well that something to point out, the candidates was a really big thing in those days, because by getting to the candidates tournament, you got the Grandmaster title. Now these days, Grandmaster title's not what it was, obviously, but back then being in the Grand title meant you were one of the world's elite. So if you read the memoirs of people like Averbach managed to qualify for the candidates tournament, for the interzonal. He then had to qualify for the candidates tournament, and he very nearly didn't. He went through some real tough times in the last few games. And that tournament in Zurich in 1953, you had a whole new generation of players coming through. You had Petrosian, you had Taimanov, Geller, Averbach, a whole list of new names coming through. All became grandmasters when they got to that tournament. So yeah, and a fantastic lineup. And of course, it was Smyslov who won.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think Rejewski and Keres and Bronstein were next. But again, Rejewski, that was quite an achievement by him, because again, if you read the recent books that have been published, there seems to have been possibly a little bit of collusion by the Soviet players, in that they decided to take it a little bit easier against each other and give a hard time to Rejewski. But he managed to tie for second, even though he was there on his own, whereas the Soviet delegation was big. They didn't just have the players, they had another dozen or more people along there, seconds, and probably psychologists and all sorts of other sports psychologists and who knows what, but they had a massive delegation, whereas it was just Rejewski on his own with his wife and children. So quite an achievement by him. So it shows what a strong player he was.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when Bronstein's charges came out, which he waited until I think 2001 rather. Victor Korchnoi reaction was, if you really hated this tournament, why did you write such a beautiful book? And Smyslov's reaction was, Davy, he called him Davy all the time, Davy, why are you spoiling such a good tournament? I don't think it spoils it. I think it adds a level of interest that doesn't exist with other tournaments. Smyslov's response, by the way, it really wasn't very much. He didn't defend himself, basically. He just said, well, you know, a lot of bad things happened and by other people, and Bronstein shouldn't be so proud of the way that he won the previous candidates tournament, where there was probably even more cheating. and he didn't really come up with any. But you know.
But to be just to hop in for a second, Andy. But to be clear, there were no allegations of impropriety by Smyslov, right? It was more just like the puppet masters.
Well, yeah, but the implication is he knew what was going on. He had a sense that there's this one point when all of the puppet masters are meeting with Bronstein and Smyslov, and Bronstein supposedly is having doubts about cooperating and drawing with Smyslov, and Smyslov says, "Well, yeah, but you know, Karras played to win. He refused." And Karras had been in a similar situation where they, told Karras that he had to draw with the white pieces against Smyslov. And Karras refused, and he tried to win, and he lost. And the game is remembered as one of Smyslov's greatest victories. So I think he sort of had a nodding idea of what was going on. Maybe not. The other players in the tournament sort of gave the same indication. They knew something might be going on. I asked Yuri Averbach when the Bronstein article came out. Yuri was was actually attending a Chess Collectors International convention in Philadelphia. He was giving a lecture, and I asked him afterwards, what do you think about Bronstein's article? And he said, Bronstein has a credibility problem, and, there may have been some overeager, overzealous KGB involvement there. But he said, I didn't know anything about this going on. And Mark Taimanov wrote in his memoirs, there was this general sense that under no circumstances could Reshevsky be allowed to win the tournament. And Taimanov wrote this in a book that hasn't been translated yet. It's his memoirs called, in Russian, it's like Remembering the Most. But one thing that he said that struck me in the book, Taimanov said that there's one key game where when Bronstein has played Geller, and Geller has sort of double-crossed him by, instead of throwing the game to him, he's beaten him. And Taimanov said that he saw Bronstein that night, and Bronstein was in terrible condition. He was crying, he was drunk, he was the most distraught that Taimanov had ever seen him. And that sort of confirmed in my mind that, this is a legitimate, story by Bronstein. Bronstein's just not making stuff up. Maybe he's embellishing, as Yuri Averbach said. Maybe he's giving a lot more detail. He came up with quotes that had happened 50 years before, and I always have doubts about when people reconstruct events that were that distant in the past. But on the whole, I would have to trust Bronstein's account over Smyslov's, simply because Smyslov had nothing to say. And nobody else can dispute it at this point.
That was my impression after reading your articles and a little bit of the other sources was it's really hard to know the extent or the effectiveness of the machinations, but it certainly seemed like there was something going on.
Yeah, there's another footnote there. Taimanov said, we were used to this type of stuff. He didn't say specifically what stuff, but he said, everybody who played in the candidates tournament, all the Soviet players, had already played in the interzonal a year before in Stockholm. And there we were all told, unofficially, but we were all told, you cannot try to beat Alexander Kotov. And Kotov had no business being in that interzonal. He had cheated to get into it. He got his friends, his fellow comrades in the Communist Party, to push somebody else out of the way, a guy named Lev Oranin, so that Kotov could play in it. And so the other Soviet players all drew with Kotov very quickly. Kotov won the tournament. In fact, he won it walking away. It was the greatest achievement of his career. There was an understanding, that there's some strange business going on. And I think this really began around that period because I don't think, the Soviets didn't play that often abroad before 1952, 53. So the political involvement, I think, began around that time.